It is not easy to be a musician these days. If your passion is for music, it's almost impossible to make a living just playing. Employment is intermittent. Wages are low unless you really make it. And if you do make it, if you make a hit streaming on Spotify, you will be paid in pennies. Well, the streaming service and the label take everything else. But if you think it's tough to be a musician today, try it in the court of King Saul. There, if your audience didn't like what you were doing and there was really only one member of the audience who mattered, you might find yourself pinned to a wall with a spear. And I know, of course, that there is no danger at all of our audience this morning objecting in any way to the music that they might hear. But you never know, You never know when the people of St. Andrews might choose to imitate the Bible a little too closely, so I just wanted to let our organist Martin's mind be at ease today. I took the precaution of removing all spears from the church this morning. But let's look at what Saul does in that story we read from the book of Samuel. Saul, in this story, is starting to be nervous about a certain young man named David who is in his service. Now, David is one of his best fighters, also his son-in-law. But lately, Saul has been worried because, David's getting a little bit too big for his britches. Absolute rulers always worry when their servants are more popular than they are. Now, Saul is someone who is tormented, we are told, with an evil spirit. This likely means that he suffered from what today we might call a mental health issue. Some have thought, given that he did, after all, eventually commit suicide, that maybe he suffered from clinical depression. But whatever he was afflicted with, he seemed to often have these episodes where he was kind of out of his mind. And when that happened, the only thing that could break his evil mood was the music that David played for him on the harp. And sometimes music is that gift, a gift that God gives us, that helps us to break out of a dark mood, that helps us to see hope for tomorrow, to leave behind anger and despair. That's what David could do for Saul. But one day, Saul couldn't listen to the music anymore. And he let his anger and his fear of David and his bad mood overcome him instead. And the spear was cast. And for Saul, that was the beginning of the end. He began to lose the support of his army and eventually of his kingdom. Maybe he should have listened to the music instead. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in 1756, and he died in 1791. He was an incredible musician, a fantastic composer. His personal life, by all accounts, was kind of a mess. His finances were so bad that he was buried as a pauper. But his music, that was a different story. In his music, all was in incredible and perfect order. The harmony was always just so. And he apparently had this ability to put all the notes together in his mind so that they came right out of his head and on to the manuscript. Mozart did things with music that nobody had ever done before. He pushed the forms of music available to him to new heights of excellence, and he succeeded. He succeeded in his compositions. He succeeded musically in so many ways. So much so that some might have said, some probably did say at the time, that no one would ever top what he accomplished musically. Mozart had pushed the classical styles and forms of music to their extremes. There was no reason to expect that anyone would ever be able to do so much again. No one could top him. But the thing is this: 1791, the year when Mozart died, the world changed. That was the year when the King of France tried to flee and was arrested by the revolutionary government of France. That was the year that France passed the point of no return. After 1791, France and most of Europe had been completely transformed. Gone were the days when society was seen as being in perfect order and harmony, where kings and princes and commoners and peasants all knew their places and kept to them, kept to the roles and tasks that they had always done. But the world after 1791 was a place of chaos and disorder and constant change. It was suddenly a fearful place, particularly for those who had been on top, those in the upper classes, those who were the patrons of the music. So the world for which Mozart had written his music his whole life, a world of order and predictability, no longer existed after he died. In 1792, Ludwig van Beethoven arrived in Vienna, the city where Mozart had died just the year before. And Beethoven began to emerge as a musician and composer. So his music was composed in a different world than Mozart's. And if you listen to what he wrote, you can tell. In the great works of Beethoven, there is more chaos than there is order. There is more discord than there is harmony. His music is a reflection of his times. And of course, it is not that Beethoven's music is any less beautiful or any less meaningful. It's that he had the ability to use such things to make music much more extraordinary than anything that had ever been written before. So it's really very interesting when you compare the music of Mozart and Beethoven. Both clearly were masters. Both were extraordinary composers in their own right. And their music tells us so much about the worlds they lived in, despite the fact that they lived in the same city, 1 year apart. One day, Jesus raised a complaint against the people of his generation. To what can I compare this generation, he asked. They are like children sitting in the marketplaces, calling out to others. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. Jesus seems to be speaking about the popular music of his own day, the kind of music played by young people in the streets, right? The equivalent today might be the sight of young people standing in the street dancing as they stream music on Spotify. Jesus, in this saying, is speaking to the religious-minded people of his age, the people who criticized John the Baptist and the people who were criticizing him. And what problem does Jesus have with them? His problem with them is they won't listen to the music of their times, the music that the kids are playing on the street corners. Now, of course, in part, Jesus is comparing himself and John to these two styles of popular music of his day. John, who lived out in the wilderness and ate a diet of locusts and wild honeys, who preached fasting and repenting, well, John was a bit of a downer. So he is obviously the dirge. But Jesus, who was all about joy, who didn't hesitate to enjoy food and drink with people, he is the music of the pipes, the kind of music that invites you to dance. And so Jesus is complaining to the people of his age that they have been presented with two very different kinds of ministry, and yet somehow have managed to find fault with both of them. But I'm quite sure that it is no coincidence that Jesus chose to use images and examples of popular music to make his point. He was reminding his followers to keep their eyes on the signs of the time, to be aware of the currents and the flows that were going on in society and in the wider world, because they would give an indication to what God was doing. Music, you see, is an important barometer for what is taking place in wider society. So what do you think? Do you think Jesus would want us to pay attention to the music of our times? And that can sometimes be a problem in the church, right? Because in the church, we're kind of slow to accommodate to new musical trends. Sometimes, like Saul, we only want to listen to music that is calming to our troubled souls. And honestly, in some churches, if you try to introduce new musical styles, you are bound to have a spear chucked at you. The church is not necessarily riding the latest musical wave. And we probably have to learn about more musical flexibility in years to come. But if we are slow to adopt new musical styles, that doesn't mean that we can't be open to listening to the meaning behind the music in society around us. Frankly, I'm going to say a lot of the popular music in the world today doesn't have a ton of meaning in it. A lot of it is honestly produced in a way to attract just the biggest audience, get the most streams. But some of it can manage to speak to the fears and the passions and the hopes that haunt people's lives. Take rap and hip-hop music, perhaps, as an example. Two of the most popular forms of music in our society today. This kind of music, yes, can be crude. Language can be objectionable. Attitudes towards women and other groups, frankly, sometimes can be frightening. But for many young people, especially those who've grown up in inner cities, they find nothing else that can express what they are feeling better. There are real hopes, real dreams, real grievances that are addressed in this kind of music. And that's why such songs inspire such energy. And yeah, unfortunately, it's a kind of energy that can sometimes be directed at best towards making lots of money, and at worst, towards violence and hatred. But when that energy is directed in positive and constructive ways, and it is, there is no limit to what can be accomplished. When you're willing to listen to the music, incredible possibilities are there. The music of Beethoven reflected the chaos that existed in Europe following the French revolutionary times. But if you think the French Revolution stirred things up, it's nothing compared to the turmoil we see in our world today. And so, yeah, sometimes the music of today is disturbing to listen to. Sometimes we might be tempted to ignore all forms of modern music and hope they just go away. We're Christians, right? Why can't we just hold on to old and familiar sacred forms of music and forget about everything else? Except Jesus told us to pay attention to what's happening in the society around us. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, he complained one day, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree, said another day. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Jesus didn't want us to keep our heads down, listening only to what is familiar and that we find pleasing and calming. He wanted us to raise our heads and look around and be aware of major movements in the world around us. Why was this so important to Jesus? Because he saw God at work in such things. Jesus always had a bigger understanding of God's power than we do. We tend to think God can only work through our plans, our schemes, our ways. But Jesus knew better. That's why he was always reminding people to be on their guard and to watch and to listen. Because God can come at you from just about anywhere. Even through the music that the kids are listening to on the streets. Thank you, God, that you're alive and work in this world. Let us listen to what Jesus says. Listen to the music of the times. See the signs of the times. Know where you are at work and become part of it.